Colin Pitchfork, as well as having a stupid name, is notable in British crime history, as we will discover later. But he's also returned to the news in recent years, and this has led to much public outcry and debate. Somehow his two teenage victims seem to have been lost in the maelstrom. So I wanted to look back at how these girls came to meet their deaths at the hands of a cruel and violent man in the early to mid 1980s in the Midlands of England. This is Murder of Crows. On November the 23rd, 1983, a lovely, caring 15-year-old girl named Linda Mann had been babysitting not far from her home in Narborough, Leicestershire. When she didn't return home, her parents became understandably concerned. While they checked with friends and neighbours and raised the alarm, nothing doing. And the next morning they got news that no parent ever wants to hear. Linda's body had been found on a isolated local footpath known to locals as the Black Pad. It appears that Linda was taking a shortcut towards home when she was evidently set upon by somebody. The defenseless teenager was raped and strangled and left where she fell as if she was rubbish, as opposed to the much loved daughter and sister that she actually was. Whoever had done this was clearly a cruel and callous individual. But no progress was made over the following months and years in finding the sadistic, selfish bastard that had done this despicable crime. On the 31st of July 1986, Dawn Ashworth was also 15 years old and left her home in Leicestershire to go to visit a friend's home. Now, Dawn's parents expected her home around 9:30 p.m. So when 9:30 came and went, her extremely concerned parents reported their daughter missing to the police. Minutes became hours, and with the police unable to locate Dawn, this began to stretch into days with no sign of the bubbly 15-year-old. After 2 days, with ominous parallels to the murder of Linda Mann 3 years earlier, Dawn's severely beaten, raped and strangled body was found near a little used local footpath around 10 Pound Lake. located in a wooded area. The crimes were very quickly linked through these similarities in modus operandi, but there was little information that could point in any particular direction regarding a perpetrator. The only likelihood from the crime scenes, with them both being quite isolated footpaths, was that the perpetrator was almost certainly a local man with a degree of familiarity with the areas where the bodies were found. Unfortunately, this still meant a suspect pool containing thousands of men living in the area, with no further clues to narrow that pool down. So little was achieved in the coming months. But elsewhere in the Leicestershire area, seemingly unrelated to these grisly crimes, advances were being made that would change the face of criminal investigation forever. In a laboratory at Leicester University, Alec Jeffreys, who later became Sir Alec for reasons that will become obvious, was starting to use a new technique for genotyping, or looking at certain regions of DNA samples that could successfully differentiate between individuals. Many years ago, in my previous life as a research scientist, I met Alec Jeffreys, and he was a very nice man. It's only with hindsight that I realized what he was doing and the critical importance of it.
The best way of describing me is words from a good friend of mine, Bob Williamson, when I received the Australia Prize in Canberra. And he stood up on my family's behalf and said a few nice words about me. And he said, Alec is just a perfectly ordinary guy that happens to have done something extraordinary. That's a good summary. Right, well, the discovery of DNA fingerprinting was a glorious accident, and nobody believes me, but it honestly was true. I think it best summarised by a school project that one of my grandsons did years ago when he was very young. And he described DNA fingerprinting. DNA fingerprinting was discovered by my granddad when he was messing about in the lab. And actually, you can't describe it better than that. That's exactly what we were doing. So go right the way back to 1977. I fetched up here in Leicester, and we started getting our first glimpse of very subtle variations in human DNA, very simply inherited. But these were not very informative. They were pretty scarce in human chromosomes. They're very difficult to assay. So we started thinking, well, maybe you can find bits of DNA that are much more variable than that. And we settled upon a type of DNA, initially entirely hypothetical, didn't even know it existed, where the DNA, a short region of DNA, is stuttered over and over again, and that gives you the possibility for variation between people in the numbers of those stutters. So the length of the DNA will vary. So we set off on a quest to get these. Why? Academic curiosity. But second, with very clear idea in mind that this would be very useful for medical genetics. So if you want to sort of make maps of the human genome and track down genes involved in inherited disease, these sorts of genetic markers, highly variable between people, could be really, really useful. The last thing on our mind was DNA fingerprinting and forensics and so on. So it was after a lot of false starts, completely by accident, we came up with our very first DNA fingerprint. So that was on the 10th of September 1984. And that was a moment that changed my life. So having got our first DNA fingerprint, as often happens in science, you get the technology first, and then you start thinking of applications. So as soon as we had our first DNA fingerprint, we could see on that DNA fingerprint a smudgy bit of X-ray film with a sort of barcode-like patterns on it. We had a technician from the department and a mother and father. We could see how we could tell the three apart and how the technician's DNA fingerprint seemed to be a composite of part of a mother's and a father's. So we can immediately see their potential for identification and sorting out family relationships. And also on those very first DNA fingerprints, we had a whole range of non-human species. So we had a cow, we had a lemur, we had a monkey, we even had tobacco DNA, there we are. And virtually every species worked as well. So here was not just something for human identification, this was something for identification.
What is DNA fingerprinting or DNA profiling? Leicester University geneticist Alec Jeffreys developed a technique called DNA fingerprinting in 1985. It allows DNA samples from different people to be compared to look for similarities and differences. It's used for solving crimes and can also confirm if people are related to each other, like in paternity testing. Any two people in the world have 99.9% of their DNA the same, so this process analyses the differences in the remaining 0.1%. This modern technology is called DNA profiling. It's a very sensitive technique which only needs a few skin cells, a hair root, or a tiny amount of blood or saliva. There are sections, or loci, of chromosomes, where instead of a gene consisting of a long sequence of bases, there are much shorter sequences of 3, 4, or 5 bases that are repeated many times. For example, these repeated sequences are called short tandem repeats, or STR. At these places on the chromosomes where we find these STRs, there are areas that vary in number of repeats. DNA profiling only looks at these STRs. A cell sample is collected. This could be from some blood at a crime scene, or a swab from the inside of someone's cheek, for example. The DNA is then extracted from the sample. Many copies of this DNA may be made using the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. Special enzymes called restriction endonucleases are used to cut the DNA up into different size pieces. The DNA samples are then put into wells in a special gel called agarose for the process of gel electrophoresis, which separates the DNA fragments by size. The pattern is then transferred to a nylon sheet in southern blotting. And finally, the lines produced by the DNA samples from different people are compared. So let's have a go at using DNA profiles to solve some mysteries. An item was stolen in a burglary. A drop of blood was left behind by the thief. Samples of DNA were taken from 4 suspects and compared to the sample left at the crime scene. Which suspect is guilty? Here's a clue. Look for the one that is most similar to the one from the crime scene. Pause the video while you decide. Suspect 3 is guilty. Can you see how the pattern of bands matches in Suspect 3 and the crime scene? Their DNA is the same.
So from here it took a huge leap of faith for the police to use this novel laboratory technique out in the real world. But they were out of options if they wanted to find out who took the lives of these 2 innocent girls who had their lives opening out ahead of them. So in a move of desperation, I guess, with the killing of 2 young girls still going unsolved, the police made the decision to do a mass screening of local men within the catchment area, with all men within that area being invited to give blood to be tested. Now, as we know, forensics can be paramount in generating critical evidence. But there's always a place for good old-fashioned police work. Now, thousands of men gave blood, but in 1987, during the screening process, a co-worker of Pitchfork's at the bakery where he worked was heard by a colleague bragging how he was going to earn £200, which is about £560 today, by posing as Pitchfork to give the blood sample. This conversation was reported to the police, and they quickly arrested Pitchfork and were able to test a genuine sample of Pitchfork's blood against samples taken from semen found on both girls' bodies. And the results were compelling. The fingerprinting technique had already been used to exclude an earlier a suspect in Dawn Ashworth's rape, that being 17-year-old student Richard Birkeland. But conversely, results showed that Pitchfork was unquestionably the contributor in both cases. At trial, he was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 30 years on the 22nd of January 1988. On appeal, the 30-year minimum term was reduced to 28 years. So rapid maths means that would take us from 1988 to 2016. And he was actually released on parole in September of 2021, but was recalled to prison after only a month for approaching a lone female while out litter picking, thereby breaching his release conditions. But even since then, the saga has kept rumbling on, with many people criticising the decision to release him at all.
Afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon, Ian. Well, I would twin it with a well-known fictional film called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a very popular film back in, I think it was the 80s. Well, our criminal justice system and the parole room system in Britain today is equivalent to the reality of the asylum system. The decisions on sentencing are as bad as I've ever seen, and those that are released from prison, having committed the most appalling of crimes, are equivalent. They're often mad decisions, and every time their name arises, the families, the victims' families, live or relive the true horror of a true life sentence. And you're right. I mean, in this case, this individual, Pitchfork, he murdered two young girls, 15 years of age. He strangled them and he murdered them, raped them. Two different times, 3 years apart, back in the 80s. He got 30 years in 1988. That was reduced to 28 years in 2009 on an appeal. And he'd also indecently exposed himself to 1,000 women. Now, somebody sane, please tell me that this is a rational decision, the right decision to protect society and send the right message out to the public, because this guy is clearly a danger to women until every day, every breath he's got in his body, until it finishes.
And how do you, I mean, who knows what goes on? And, you know, the parole board isn't, you know, two people. It's a lot of people involved in these decisions. What could you imagine, Norman, the thought process would be? Bearing in mind, I mean, this isn't just a case of discussing his first release. This will be the second time, because, of course, he was released back in 2022. and 2021 and breached his conditions. So we know this man can't be trusted.
Well, what they said, I read up on the case, the parole board said there were some anomalies which weren't actually correct. But to be quite honest, that's pretty irrelevant. From what I understand, he was approaching young girls.
Yeah.
What was he convicted for? Murdering 2 young girls.
Correct.
What was he convicted for? Indecently exposing himself to over 1,000 women. 2 or 3 decades earlier, Ian, for the murder and rape of one 15-year-old girl, he would have been strung up, he would have been hung, and he would have received the appropriate sentence. This guy went on 3 years later to do exactly the same to another girl. He got 30 years. Now, that's no life sentence. It's equivalent today to probably about 2.5 times a life sentence. Yeah. Now, when you think about it, he's out. The 2 young girls are in the ground. The families have lived torture in the true life sentence, and here they see him and those that are alive now walking the streets free. It's bizarre, and I open this chat in relation to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This criminal justice system we have today and the parole board system we have today is the reality of a criminal justice system constantly flying over the cuckoo's nest, and it's the public and victims that actually stare in amazement at what's happened.
Absolutely.
The families of his victims have been outraged by the decision to release Pitchfork. Rebecca Eastwood is the younger sister of Colin Pitchfork's victim, Linda Mann, and she now lives in Liverpool. She has been outspoken on Pitchfork's potential release in the past, and in 2016 said if he was released into the community, he's fully capable of killing again. I don't think someone like Pitchfork can change or be rehabilitated. She added that she was concerned for her mother, Kath Eastwood, who brought her up after her older sister's death. She said, "It's too much for my mum now, so I'm determined to fight him now. I am doing this for my mum, who's had enough. I was only 2 when my sister was murdered, but knowing that my mum still managed to bring me up while dealing with that, I know it's been so hard for her. My mum never sat and dwelt on it all, but she's broken inside, and I don't think she could hold it together if Pitchfork was released." In 2021, after his release, she held the same view and said, "No one is truly safe. He could be living on your street or near your school. I believe he will kill again." Barbara Ashworth, the mother of Dawn Ashworth, said this year, "It's diabolical. He's obviously going to have an urge. We just don't know what's in his mind. I don't think there's any way he should be walking the streets. He can't hurt me anymore, but he could cause disruption. He's able to make the parole board believe whatever he wants to say. As recently as June of this year, Pitchfork was granted parole again. But just a few weeks later, it was said that that decision was to undergo further reconsideration. The latest parole hearing took place on the 2nd and 3rd of this month, October 2023. But the results have not yet been released to the public. So while the lives of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth were snuffed out in 1983 and 1986 respectively, we are still talking about Colin Pitchfork's ongoing life some 40 years later. But thankfully, it is only from a public protection point of view. Colin Pitchfork has his place in UK criminal history as being the first person to be convicted using DNA evidence. If not for Alec Jeffrey's revolutionary method, it is unlikely that anyone would have been brought to justice for the deaths of the two lovely teenagers. Most definitely a milestone moment, with DNA evidence now almost being taken for granted. While the Pitchfork debate will no doubt rumble on, the main purpose of this video is to remember the two wonderful young ladies who had their lives ended before they'd begun. The video is, of course, dedicated to Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth and all of those whose lives were affected by the selfish, depraved actions of one cruel man. Thank you for watching another episode of Murder of Crows. I'm Steve. This is Samson. And we'll see you when we see you.